Session 2, the humanitarian crisis and the impact of the war on the ground, which I think the last two questions wanted us to focus on anyhow. So the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is one of the worst in modern history. Nearly 4 years of conflict and severe economic decline are driving the country on the brink of famine, exacerbating the needs in all sectors. With an estimated population of 30 million people, the United Nations says 80% of them, or 24 million, are in need, with 14.3 million who are in acute need. And the severity continues to deepen, with the number of people in acute need staggeringly 27% higher than just this time last year. 2/3 of all districts are already pre-famine, and 1/3 face a convergence of multiple acute vulnerabilities. More than 20 million people across the country are food insecure, including nearly 10 million who are suffering from extreme levels of hunger. A total of 17.8 million people lack access to clean water, to sanitation, and 19.7 million lack adequate health care. Add to that poor sanitation, waterborne diseases, and cholera, the needs continue to intensify in all sectors. And just last year, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator warned that 14 million people, half of Yemen's population, are at the risk of starving to death. So widespread conflict, severe economic decline, food insecurity, the collapse of essential services continue to take an enormous toll on the population of Yemen. And this panel is going to address just that. The humanitarian and human rights situation in Yemen, the guarantees of humanitarian access, travel both in and out, documenting what's happening and its challenges, the absence of government control and violations, and to that end, let me introduce our distinguished panel. They will each give a few introductory remarks, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A, and then we'll open it to the floor to all of you. Our first speaker is Kathryn Achilles. She's Oxfam's Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor since 2017, leading advocacy with the United Nations Security Council on crisis contexts, including Yemen. The next speaker after her will be Priyanka Motaparthy, is a senior researcher for the Emergencies Divisions of Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining the Emergencies team, she was a children's rights researcher for the Middle East and North Africa. Following Priyanka, Afrah Nasser is a Yemeni journalist, founding editor-in-chief of Sana Review. She was a 2017 recipient of the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award. And finally, Rawya, who I've followed for a very long time, is Amnesty International Senior Crisis Advisor. Her work here includes documenting the violations of human rights violations in the Philippines, Syria, and Yemen. Prior to that, she was a journalist for 15 years, covering the Middle East and Africa for the Associated Press and Al Jazeera English. Their extensive bios are in your booklets. We're not going to take any more of your time discussing their bios, so I would please like to turn the table first to our first speaker, Kathryn Achilles.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the introduction. I should probably start by introducing my own organization, which is the reason why I'm here today. And Oxfam has been working in Yemen for about 30 years, which is an incredibly long and shocking amount of time to be providing humanitarian assistance in a country. And since July 2015, we've reached more than 3 million people in 9 governorates, working in the north and in the south, to provide everything from cash assistance to allow people to buy food, water and sanitation services. We work with local women's leaders to support local peace-building processes and to support their engagement in the international peace process. I usually start these types of talks by talking about the numbers, and I think the numbers have already been introduced and are shocking. I mean, what we are looking at in 2019 is 80% of the country are going to require some sort of assistance from humanitarian actors this year. And that is worse, and it continues to deteriorate every year that we have conflict. And I think it's really easy to listen to numbers of $2.4 billion required to support 24 million people. And it's really easy to lose sight of what that actually means to people, and it's very easy to become overwhelmed. And a lot of the time how we see that iterated in the media is in very visual images of children in health and feeding centers and starving children. And those photos are powerful and important to show the real scale of the human tragedy that is behind the conflict in Yemen, but there is so much more behind those pictures than is ever told by those one images. I mean, those children are already lucky enough to have been able to access a feeding or nutritional center. That means that their families have the resources to be able to travel. It means that they've often taken great personal risk to cross front lines, to travel down roads with checkpoints that may be at risk of airstrike, that may be mined, that may put them at different types of physical risk. It often means they've left other children at home or have not been able to go to work because they've taken their children to be looked after. And it often means that they're living in a place where food is available and they just can't afford to buy it. And it means that has happened for months and months and months. It's a slow decline to when we get to those images of children, and it affects the entire family. Children become more vulnerable to disease when they don't have access to food. People often can't make food safely for children if there's no clean water. And so the crisis in Yemen and the visuals that we see belie an incredibly complex humanitarian disaster, and it's multifaceted and it's multi-layered, and it affects every single member of families, and it affects people in multiple different ways. And the scale of what that means for people who are trying to survive cannot be underestimated. I want to talk a little bit and just raise, I think, quickly 5 key factors that for humanitarian agencies really impact and affect our ability to support Yemeni families right now. And I think the first that I want to talk about is imports and the importance of imports in Yemen. 90% of Yemen's food comes in to the country, it's imported. And about 70% of that currently comes through the ports of Hodeidah and Salif. And that is humanitarian assistance, yes, but it's also commercial food options. And a lot of the restrictions and blockades that we have seen on food and other goods being imported into Yemen have a direct consequence for families. It makes them much more expensive. It doesn't mean that they're not coming in, and it doesn't mean that there is no food in Yemen. It means that it is simply unaffordable. And the coalition restrictions on imports have had a massive impact, and we're still seeing those today. So while the November 2017 blockade was lifted, only 1 container cargo ship has been allowed into those ports since November 2017, and that means that no commercial imports or humanitarian imports of milk powder, of medicines, of cooking oil have been able to go there. They all have to go to Aden, and that makes it much more expensive for both commercial importers and humanitarians to be able to move food and goods around the country. And it also puts those moving those goods around the country at personal risk. I mean, we're asking truck drivers to drive across front lines every day to make sure that food gets across the country. And associated with that is the massive economic crisis that has engulfed Yemen, particularly over the last few months, that has had huge impacts. Where food is available and people used to be able to afford it, massive price increases of up to 124% have simply rendered many families who were coping completely unable to cope anymore. And it also has had direct impacts for humanitarians to be able to do programming when we can't guarantee when we're giving cash support, for example, to families to be able to purchase food on the market, that the cash support that we're giving them will be adequate to meet their needs from week to week or month to month. And so that is having a massive impact on people's lives, but also on our ability to support them. And it's important to note that the reliance on imports makes the humanitarian situation in Yemen much more fragile and much more difficult to plan for. Any disruption to Hodeidah, any escalation in fighting, despite the fragile ceasefire, would have catastrophic impacts. There is no way for humanitarian or commercial actors to be able to get sufficient food into the country if Hodeidah port and Salif ports are taken out of action. Aden and other ports are also vital, but the food security situation in Yemen has always been so fragile that none of the ports can compensate for each other. We need them all open and fully functional to be able to support people. The second issue that I want to raise is the issue of institutions. I think everyone here knows that poor governance is and has been a feature of Yemen for many years. And the fact that public services have ground to a halt means that a lot of what we would call safety nets or support networks for people to access simply don't exist anymore. And the split in the central bank has meant that many civil servants, who are often supporting around 8 people themselves, have either not had their salaries paid or have only had partial payments in the past 2 years. And so again, this is eroding people's ability to access food and other services because they simply don't have the financial means to do it. Third, I want to talk about, just to raise the issue of infrastructure. and IHL, the conflict and all parties to the conflict have constantly had a disregard both for civilian lives but also civilian infrastructure. That means that bridges, hospitals, schools, factories that produce food and medicine that are necessary for people to survive have all been damaged or attacked by all parties to the conflict. And that has had a massive impact on the availability of those goods, but also again on the cost, and have real impact on people's ability to provide water for themselves, to be able to grow their own food, to be able to purchase goods in the market where they're available, and has increased the costs. And so the effect of those attacks on infrastructure that should be protected under international law is an ongoing issue and will be for years to come, even if the conflict ended tomorrow. Repairing those would be massively problematic. And then finally, humanitarian access in Yemen is an incredibly difficult process. Nobody has clean hands in Yemen when it comes to facilitating or ensuring that civilians in need have access to the services and the assistance that they require. And that is everything from the attacks that I mentioned on schools and hospitals. It is the attacks on water facilities, including humanitarian-built water facilities for civilians, to bureaucratic impediments, requirements that we get travel permissions, requirements that we submit proposals, requirements that everything is authorized, all delay our ability to reach people as quickly as we need to be able to, and especially when people are being freshly displaced and we might need to try and provide more immediate response. Those impediments have a huge impact on our ability to actually support people. To finish quickly, we often talk from a humanitarian perspective about what we do and the issues that affect us. And I think it's really important to note that Yemenis are not the passive recipients of international aid from organizations like Oxfam. We, as Oxfam, work with many Yemeni organizations, and most of our staff are Yemeni from across the divide. And Yemenis have been at the forefront of supporting each other. Most of the people that we talk to, give food to friends and neighbors when they need it. They loan cash when people need it. They're on the front line of trying to build peace initiatives, of trying to negotiate access, of trying to ensure that people have access to the services and goods that they need. And the humanitarian response in Yemen would not be able to be run without it being led and run by so many Yemeni people. But the humanitarian situation continues to get worse and worse and worse. And a lot of people's ability to cope, the ability to be able to lend cash, the ability to find medicine from somewhere is being eroded, and it continues to be eroded. And we have been very fortunate, I think, that Yemen hasn't hit a formal famine as yet, but that does not mean the situation is good, and that does not mean that it is not very imminent and the situation is very fragile. In 2014, before the war broke out, 14 million people in Yemen needed assistance. Today, 10 million more people require that assistance, and that is just because of the war. That is men with guns who have ruined the lives of millions and millions and millions of people in Yemen. And we can bandage it and we can plaster it over as humanitarians, and we can provide the assistance to keep people alive, but to thrive and to succeed and to have a dignified life, Yemenis need peace. Humanitarians need money and we need access, but Yemenis need peace. And as for Oxfam and other humanitarian organizations, at the end of the day, that is our core message. We need the peace process to succeed, and we need to see a drastic escalation in violence and much more improved access so that we can ensure that people in Yemen have the ability to access and receive the support that they need in the short term.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll turn to Priyanka.
Thank you so much. I will restrict myself to three main points. I've been personally visiting Yemen since 2003, and I've been working on the conflict in Yemen as an investigator for Human Rights Watch since 2016. And since that time, we've really been puzzling over this issue of humanitarian access, humanitarian aid, and what was causing the dramatic deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. And by puzzling, what I want to say is so many people that we speak to would like to see a single, unitary, easy-to-solve cause for the humanitarian situation in Yemen. They would like to say this party is to blame, this, particular side is to blame, this particular obstacle, if only we could remove that one large obstacle, then we could solve this issue. But over the years that I've looked at the humanitarian situation in Yemen, speaking to humanitarians working on the ground, humanitarians like Kathryn, humanitarians who are Yemeni nationals, working for local organizations, working for international organizations, we've heard that it's not just one factor, but just multiplicity of factors which people have started describing, which people describe as death by 1,000 cuts. What does this mean? So a lot of focus on the humanitarian situation has focused on the naval blockade, the coalition-led naval blockade, which has prevented food from reaching ports in Yemen. And that is certainly a significant and important factor. But when we've looked closely at the humanitarian situation in Yemen, what we find is that goods, both humanitarian and commercial goods, which are a key part of the picture, as my fellow panelist has pointed out, face obstacles at literally every step of the way. So from the moment they, try to reach the territorial waters of Yemen, the pre-approvals that they need to get, the types of insurances that they need to get, then the permission to enter the port. If goods are able to enter a port in Yemen, the process of leaving that port, the capacity of the port to actually accept, offload goods, and then to transport those goods to other parts of Yemen. What does this mean in human rights terms? Under international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, it is prohibited to deny humanitarian aid. It is prohibited for states to deny humanitarian aid, and is prohibited for parties in control of territory to deny humanitarian aid. It is also prohibited to use starvation as a weapon of war. And yet, it has been very, very difficult to advance this argument because there are so many factors contributing to the humanitarian situation. So the blockade is a part of it, but then we also have a number of bureaucratic burdens placed on humanitarians by different parties to the conflict. We have the issue of humanitarian visas. Numerous humanitarian organizations bringing international staff into the country have talked about how difficult it is for them to get visas, both to the north and as well to southern Yemen, depending on the time period and the political situation. We have, multiple examples of Houthi authorities trying to dictate humanitarian programming. So saying, X hospital should not be providing, for example, maternal and infant care. They should be providing only assistance to combatants or assistance to trauma injuries. We also have the attempt to divert aid, to collect beneficiary lists that we see a lot in the north, and to, through these means, control how aid is being distributed. The second point I want to make also builds on Kathryn's point, which is how the conduct of hostilities, how the hostilities are being conducted. Human Rights Watch has documented numerous attacks on key civilian infrastructure. Speaking of water points, in late 2016, I visited a village outside of Sana'a called Arhab, where villagers had pooled their money together in order to build a water well. They had hired a drilling rig and worked for months to finance and then execute the project. The well was on the verge of being completed when, in the middle of the night, it was struck. It was hit by an airstrike. In the morning, when people came to collect the bodies of the victims, it was again hit by multiple airstrikes. And this is just one example of how a community struggling to survive has had its chance at a better life, its chance at access to water for farming purposes, water for livelihood, has had that access to a key element necessary for livelihood completely destroyed. I've visited medicine factories, food storage facilities that have been hit by airstrikes as well. On the side of the Houthis, there has been widespread use of landmines since the earliest days of this war in 2015. On my most recent trip to Yemen last month, we again documented widespread use of landmines in the Western Coast operation. And these landmines are not just a problem for victims who are often young children, like 15-year-old Abdu, who I met, who had been fleeing the conflict with his family and lost his leg below the knee. They are also a problem for humanitarian access. We met with multiple humanitarians on the ground who told us that they were restricted to traveling on hard asphalt roads. They could not reach some of the communities that were most in need because those communities were only accessible by traveling on dirt roads. But they couldn't travel on those roads because there was no map of where these mines had been laid. No one could guarantee that they would be safe. The landmines have also destroyed access to livelihoods, and this is, I think, a key third point in looking at the humanitarian situation. Both landmines and the way that hostilities have been conducted more generally have resulted in the destruction of livelihoods that have kept families alive for generations. When we were meeting people fleeing the Western Coast, we met many people who relied for their livelihood on date farming, as well as people who relied on deep-sea fishing. Date farmers told us how they had been caught amidst warring parties, how their date farms had been mined, and how they were no longer able to access those lands, leading to the death of trees that they had cultivated for years and sometimes for decades. Fishermen told us that journeys to the sea that used to take them, 15 minutes, a few hours, now took them days because they had to pass by multiple military checkpoints. And then they risked attack at sea. We interviewed multiple fishermen who had been out in the deep sea waters, attempting to continue their livelihood, only to find themselves attacked by coalition forces. So these 3 points, the bureaucratic obstacles by all parties to the conflict, the conduct of hostilities, the destruction of infrastructure and livelihoods, and finally the long-term effects of the war that prevent people from earning their living have contributed to the dire humanitarian situation we find today.
Thank you so much. Afrah?
Hello? Oh, okay. That was a very bleaky picture. Within the 21 speakers in this conference, none of us came from Yemen directly. As someone who's going to speak about the civil society organization in Yemen, I would have loved that someone would come from Yemen and speak about their work inside the country. But, the first challenge for that to happen is the on and off travel ban. And it's such a shame that only the privileged people could go and have access to Yemen, while Yemenis are trapped in siege and not able to come and speak to, policymakers here in the US or even to the public to raise awareness about their situation in Yemen, while American bombs have an easy access to be dropped in Yemen. Yemenis are not wanted. Yemenis are trapped in borders. Just last week, one Yemeni journalist was found drowned in the Algerian coast as he was fleeing Yemen, aiming to reach Spain, I think. So it's shocking how all powers seem to be against Yemenis and trapping them and not allowing them to, let their stories reach such important places like the US or UK or, other European countries. It's very, very personal for me to talk about the Yemen Civil Society Organization because I owe everything that I know, from my political awareness to the women who really led the civil society organizations in Yemen. As someone who comes from, non-political family, from Harat al-Raqas in Sana'a, I had really, my expectations or my aspiration were really limited as a woman, as a Yemeni first, and then second as a woman. But because thanks to places like late Dr. Raufa Hassan Center in Sana'a, or Tawakkol Karman, Yemeni Women Journalists Without Borders organization in Sana'a, the Yemeni Women Journalists Forum for Rahma Hujaira, which seems all like coming to be led by Yemeni women. Thanks to these places, I had, feminist schooling, my political awareness about democracy, social justice, and freedom of press and freedom of expression. These places really that fostered my understanding and led my path to where I am today. The travel ban seems like the first problem for an access, but also there seems to be unwillingness or a deliberate desire to exclude Yemen from especially foreign funding opportunities to the civil society organization, because how challenging, and it could be sometimes time-consuming, money-consuming. It could be like a full-time job just to try to have an access or to get someone from Yemen to travel outside to the US or other places. Because of all of these challenges, organizations and foundations tend to be kind of segregating Yemen from other opportunities given to other countries, affected by conflicts. Unfortunately, Syria, for example, because they're able to reach to Germany and other places, they have had, in comparison to Yemenis, they've had a better off situation when it comes to foreign funding opportunities. But another problem also, like talking about the external problems, is that something that you mentioned, because of the deteriorated Yemeni economy, some of the funding opportunities really lacks understanding of how the currency exchange could really limit or make some people really in a disadvantaged position, because of the value of Yemeni rial has lost most of its value. And also, it's very important to have the support for these organizations and trying to understand how the polarization in Yemen has become. It's really, really difficult without having really the absolute strong bond or a connected kind of coalition to support individual or organization from the civil society. Sometimes they would be in a very risky situation. For example, just yesterday, Rageh al-Mutawakkil from Muwatana organization in Yemen, she had a very powerful hearing in the U.S. House, you call it? The U.S. House Foreign Affairs. And it's shocking, like the amount of hatred and attacks she got online, because everyone changed their, or depending on their political affiliation, would absolutely attack you if you don't fit into their side. And also, it's very important that to know that this venue for civil society organization have been also hijacked by other powers. Let's say there are organizations funded by the Yemeni government or by the Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, just to attack the other side. And it's very important to take that in consideration whenever you're trying to create some solidarity with organizations similar to Muwatana. Since I don't have much time, but I would like to finish with just one story that maybe could give you an idea about what one person could go through coming from the civil society community in Yemen. There was a newspaper called Ashara that had its peak fame in 2011. It's a local locally led publication. It doesn't have a website. It only has a Facebook page, but it doesn't even like publish the text online because the group depend on the revenue that when they sell the newspaper. 2011 was it was the honeymoon for democracy in Yemen. And it was very popular. I would say it was the first or the most popular newspaper at that time. And then 2014 happened, and the Houthi-led coalition with Ali Abdullah Saleh took over of Sana'a. And guess what? The first enemy they went to attack was to hit the state TV, state radio, and also like start to attacking journalists, harassing them, threatening them, arresting them. And then the newspaper really fell off. Most of the journalists, they were like in prison or harassed, or some of them even fled to their villages, escaping or trying to avoid the risk. And then the chief editor was sent death threats. And then because he was very vocal on social media, he was hit in his leg, Nabil Subay. And there are other examples where Mohammed Al-Absi, for example, who was assassinated by the Houthis. We can debate and investigate, but many people believe that he was assassinated by the Houthis. So, and other journalists from the newspaper, Nabil fled to Egypt. I had the chance to meet him and spoke about his situation, and he's dealing with a lot of traumas because of that incident. And I can see we just lost one of the most vocal and partial and respectful journalists because he really don't have the energy anymore to report. Other colleagues of Nabil, for example, Hani Al-Junaid, he had to flee to Taiz because he was harassed by the Houthis in Sana'a. And in Taiz, because of his also writings on social media, he was criticizing what the armed groups were doing in Taiz, and he was also again harassed in Taiz, and he had to flee to Aden. And in Aden, he started also like reporting about the situation in Aden through his social media. And again, he was harassed and sent death threats by terrorist groups funded mainly by Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. And he could even give me some names of people who really, he knows, like it was not random, it was systematic and targeted. They wanted to silence him. He was kidnapped for one day. He sent me, we didn't hear anything about him for one day. And luckily, because of a lot of local and regional pressure from other pro-press organization, we were able to free him. He was freed, but after like a horrible 24 hours of torture that he cannot even reveal today. Thankfully, he fled to Egypt. In Egypt, he also like faced a lot of threats because Egypt is in a good shape, as we all know. And today, he's in Korea, South Korea, that rejects Yemeni refugees. And that tells you like the agony of these individuals trying to build their country. But because of all these factors coming together, the situation has been, I think, even if you speak to the old generation, it has never been this difficult before.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rawya?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, for the Foundation and the Center for National Security for putting this incredible event together, and Dr. Dalia for moderating this important discussion. Incredible points brought up by all my fellow panelists here, so I'll try to keep my remarks very brief. As a senior researcher with Amnesty International, my work on Yemen has touched on all of the themes that my fellow panelists here raised, and I must say this is my second all-women panel in this exact room, so Thank you, Karen, and everyone. So it was really amazing to come here. As I mentioned, as a researcher for Amnesty International, I've been part of the work on documentation of human rights violations in Yemen. And if we just take a look at, I'd like to acknowledge the date. We're gathered here today. In just a few weeks, we'll be marking what is 4 years since the campaign of bombardment led by the Saudi and UAE-led coalition targeting the Houthi armed group in Yemen. And since that coalition led bombardment started in March of 2015, Amnesty International has been documenting all sorts of violations committed by all parties to the conflict. So essentially all parties have been violating international humanitarian law, their obligations under international humanitarian law through attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. And what I want to point out here when we talk about the conflict in Yemen, and I really dislike sort of comparisons, but if you take a look at the more recent conflicts in the region and the intractable conflicts in the region, when we take a look at Yemen, the reality is that a lot of international parties have actual leverage in this particular conflict, right? There is much that can be done to stop these violations. This humanitarian crisis is an entirely man-made crisis. Yes, even before the war, some of the communities in Yemen were in a very difficult position, humanitarian-wise, but a lot of what we're seeing today is entirely man-made, and there's so much that can be done to stop it. The question is the actual willingness and all sorts of other calculations that come into play. So for example, if we take a look at the attacks that we've documented, whether Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or even, if I may cite the most recent reporting that we have from Muwatana, one of the more preeminent human rights organizations, one of the largest human rights organizations in Yemen. They just issued a really important report yesterday, which Afrah mentioned, Rageh was testifying to Congress about. They documented from 2015 to 2018 at least 27 apparently unlawful coalition attacks in which weapons or parts of weapons from the US and the UK were used, right? So hence, the involvement of the international community is not just when it comes to leverage. There is essentially indirect involvement. Some may even call it complicity when you have weapons from all sorts of Western countries, from Australia, from South Korea, all sorts of governments providing weapons to the coalition that end up being used in illegal attacks in Yemen, causing massive civilian harm and damage to civilian infrastructure. There can be much that can be done, and that's why we have a consistent call at Amnesty International. In fact, it's a call that other human rights organizations share to halt armed transfers to these countries that are involved in these violations in Yemen, because we've seen their track record and how these weapons are being used. And it's been very inspiring to see the traction. This is the movement that's happening, the bipartisan really activity that's happening on the Hill when it comes to this particular issue. But it's not just obviously the United States, there's so many other countries involved in this. One of the other aspects or violations that I'd like to bring up before we open it up for remarks, I just want to keep my remarks very brief so we have as much discussion as we can, is the issue of detention-related violations. We've documented violations by the Houthis as well as by the coalition in the south when it comes to arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearance, torture, and ill treatment. And this particular issue is really very close to my heart. I mean, one of the images that I find very difficult to get out of my mind from one of my recent trips my last trip to Yemen last summer, were these group of mothers standing in 50-degree heat in Aden outside the house of the Minister of Interior. Some of these mothers hadn't known the whereabouts of their sons for up to 3 years. Imagine the agony of not just knowing that your son had been arbitrarily arrested, not knowing what he was arrested for, but not knowing whether he's even alive or not for 3 years. This pattern of violations is particularly problematic because it gets very little attention, and it's one that has the potential for very long-term damage, right? Once the bombs end, once the campaign of bombardment ends, people tend to forget about those who are missing and disappeared for years and years and years. Hence, it was very important to see the discussion about prisoners' exchange as part of the, or revealing the fate of the disappeared as part of the conversations in Stockholm and Sweden in the ceasefire talks. So that pattern of violation, again, and it's, by the way, one of the pattern of violations that, again, international parties have a lot of leverage in addressing. So just to give you a quick example, when our report this summer was coming out on enforced disappearance and torture by UAE forces and local forces backed by the UAE in southern Yemen, even before the report came out, in the 2 weeks prior to the report, when we submitted our findings to the government of Yemen and to the UAE authorities, sharing with them our findings and asking questions about some of the violations, that letter coincided with another story that the AP had really been leading on this coverage, as well as Human Rights Watch. Our report came as a one-year follow-up to that work by AP and Human Rights Watch. So our letters to the governments coincided with a news story by the AP about serious allegations of torture in these network of secret prisons that had been revealed the year prior. And just as these two pieces of, the letters and the stories came out, were handed to the governments, we saw large numbers of people being transferred from unofficial facilities to official facilities, as well as some releases from these prisons. In other words, pressure does yield results when it comes to the question of detentions and enforced disappearance. The important thing is to keep up this pressure and to keep up this kind of work and documentation.
Thank you so much. So in the 25 minutes we have left, I'm going to ask one large general question. All of you can address it, and then we'll open the floor because I feel the questions. The first is, as a professor of conflict studies, when we look at what is violence, there's direct violence, right? The actual killing. Then there's the structure of violence, what leads to endemic famine and poverty and everything affecting Yemenis today. But then there's the culture of violence, everything that causes us to not see what's happening and to not care. And it's tied to everything you've spoken about, the international linkages, that it's not just the direct hunger and the direct needs of people, but that there are fundamental international violations by several countries here. And the international linkages are what we don't usually focus on when we talk about the human rights violations. Not just the secret detention centers, but that we're turning Yemen's seaports and airports into detention centers and military barracks. We're looking at several international violations by countries, not just the US and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran, and all of these linkages that continue this conflict, not for the sake of Yemenis, but at the expense of Yemenis. And so when we think about this culture of violence that continues to allow this to perpetuate, in all of your experiences, and several of you have returned from the region recently or up until last year, we see the agreements out of Geneva saying, well, there's going to be $2.6 billion for humanitarian aid. But what is after that? What comes after? It's not just about feeding the hungry. It's not just about poverty alleviation. It's not just about attacking the direct violence, but it's the structure of violence and the culture of violence and its continuation. So I was wondering if each of you can take a few minutes to speak to that, and then we'll open the floor.
Dalia, I think that's just an incredible question and a really, a great way to frame this issue. And I really want to thank Afrah as well for calling attention to the way in which the conflict in Yemen, the humanitarian crisis, and the situation in Yemen has really been cut off from the rest of the world in such a profound way. The only reason that I am here, that many of us are here sitting on this panel is because it is so difficult to bring Yemeni voices from Yemen to this situation.
Because I live in Sweden, that's how I was able to come. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, I would like to see as many of us as possible to take it as our personal mission to do this work of trying to elevate Yemeni voices, of trying to bring the people most directly affected by the conflict into the forums where their voices really should be taking the forefront. So I just want to really, emphasize that point as well. In terms of, but again, in terms of, then as a non-Yemeni, as a foreigner trying to draw attention to this conflict and to situate it within a system of global violence, I also want to call attention to how difficult it has been for others who are genuinely concerned with the situation of Yemen, who, would like to see human rights standards being protected for people to be able to live in human dignity, how difficult it also is for us to go to the country and to be able to access accurate, verifiable information from the ground. It's an extraordinary privilege that I was able to travel to Yemen last month, and it took months of work in order to organize this visit. And if for me, as a holder of a Western passport, a member of an international human rights organization, if it takes that amount of effort to simply visit, to be able to document what's happening there, and this is not my visit was only to the south. I mean, the difficulties of going to northern Yemen are only compounded or exponentially more difficult. I visited Yemen, I think 3 or 4 times over the course of the conflict, and every time I visit, I'm afraid that it will be the last time I'm able to go there. So I think, we need to situate our discussion within this profound disconnect, this purposeful isolation that has been imposed on Yemen from the rest of the world.
Your question touches on so many themes, and I will pick one that's also very close to the causes that we call for. I think one of the biggest problems when we look at the situation in Yemen is an ongoing culture of impunity, right? And when human rights organizations like ours, when we ask for accountability, when we ask for justice, why do we ask for this, right? Are we being quixotic? Is it because we love international law? No, it's because accountability and justice have actual, tangible ramifications, right? It's what we call a guarantee of non-repetition, right? How do you ensure that the pattern of detentions in southern Yemen stop, detention violations rather, or by the Houthis for that matter, right? You have to have investigations. You have to have these problematic officials removed from position. You can't have a situation where the same officials continue to be in position and then expect that these secret prisons are going to disappear. They're not going to disappear. If you don't have remedy and accountability, there is not a guarantee of non-repetition, right? And we rarely ever see the question of justice, accountability, investigations as part of the conversation when the conflict is happening, because parties to the conflict, so in a situation like the talks in Sweden, for example, right? One of the calls that Human Rights Watch, Motaparthy, and Amnesty had made was you have to have the questions of these human rights violations at the heart of the conversation, because parties tend to have a very narrow interest focused, because they don't want to make it a bigger, complicated discussion. But the reality is that these issues of accountability are at the heart of the discussion because they prevent the ongoing pattern of abuse from repeating.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and make 2 very different points. I think, firstly, just to say about Geneva, money is generous and needed and welcome, but checks are not an ease on the conscience of the states that are supporting parties to this conflict. And too often, money is seen that way, and is certainly can not always mean that pressure is put on those parties. When people write checks for $1 billion, I think in many quarters that allows that blind eye to be turned and allows for that discussion about what they're actually doing in the country to not happen. In terms of thinking about what next, the humanitarian crisis might end next week or next month or next year, but the lifelong health impacts and quality of life impacts on ordinary Yemenis will last a lifetime. If you are malnourished as a child, you carry around consequences for the rest of your life. It affects your development, it affects puberty, it affects the rest of your life. Access to health can leave, improper health services can leave lifelong health consequences. And so it's really important that we focus on not just the short-term impacts of violence and the humanitarian crisis now, but what that crisis is going to look like in people's lives in 20 and 30 and 40 years, even with a resolution to the conflict. And then I want to make maybe a much bigger point, which is most of my job here in New York is talking to the UN Security Council about Yemen and lots of other parts of the world that they don't always want to talk about. And I think, you know, when I started in September 2017, the idea that the Security Council would pass a resolution on Yemen, host a monthly briefing on Yemen, talk about Yemen more than every 3 months was laughable. I mean, it was seen as completely unrealistic that we could have conversations about what was happening in Yemen because of the alliances at a regional and international level. And I think a huge amount of pressure has been borne by humanitarian and human rights and Yemeni organizations particularly, including the diaspora especially, to really increase the accountability of the international community and make that increasingly unacceptable for that to happen. And I think where we are now is that at least bodies like the UN Security Council are forced to talk about Yemen on a monthly basis. And I think that discussion is far from perfect, and I think that discussion is far too influenced by those regional dynamics, and those alliances are not really focused on people's lives and what Yemen actually needs. But it is a start, and I think that pressure to make sure those debates continue really needs to be maintained as well.
Yeah. Well, I have a view about the money and funding. I've had the chance to report from the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly last year, and I saw, it was a game kind of. I think if the Saudi-led coalition destroyed Yemen, they have to pay and build it. If they destroy it, they build it. As they started the war, they have to end it and build it. They have to pay the money. But for a lot of Yemenis, we do understand this is not just a violence. It's like ruining Yemen. It's like pancaking Yemen, If you look the way cultural and historical heritage places are destroyed, why? What did that do? Anything to do with the conflict? Is it Iranian funded? Is it Houthi? Is it what? So we do understand there is a certain intention in this conflict. As a Yemeni woman, also, like the way I see how women's rights is being eroded and all political rights are being eroded in Yemen, while Saudi women are allowed to drive, to go to cinema, and all of that. It's like we're being, kept behind while they're trying to progress. Why is that? They're trying to ruin Yemen. All these power coming together are trying to ruin Yemen, and for that we need accountability. Not only for the damage being done, but also for destroying our dreams, for destroying our future. That has to be taken accountable, and all these parties have to, for justice have to be served.
And really served, not just promised. Like you have a joint investigative, mechanism that then acknowledges mistakes in airstrikes, but then we don't know who's being questioned or anyone remedied.
So we're going to open the floor. I see hands shooting up already. Awesome. Okay, I will start from this side. Yes, ma'am.
Weapons Do I start over? Okay. So you described illegal weapons being sold or sent to Yemen. Why do you think these nations are providing the weapons? And why is it their interest what is their interest besides money in the region? And whose interest is it to see Yemen fall apart?
Maybe just in the interest of time, we'll take 3 questions at a time. Is that good? So maybe 2 more questions. Go ahead, sir. We'll take both of you. Go ahead. Yeah.
So as we heard, and we all know that there's a widespread suffering in Yemen. There are millions of people who are in need. However, there are hundreds of millions of international aid to Yemen. Where is that money? My question to Oxfam, if $100 is given to Oxfam, how much of that $100 actually goes to the people in need in Yemen? Not to the local organizations who are actually corrupt, and they are much better than the Yemeni people in need. How much of that $100 actually goes to the people of Yemen? Thank you.
Just right behind him.
Thank you. Actually, they are all interesting points, but I think there is something missing here. Unlike Syria, unlike Iraq, unlike other recent crises, there is something underfunded in Yemen, more than the other crises. And it is like building the capacity of the civil society inside Yemen, and building the capacity of the human rights organizations inside Yemen. These are all underfunded. Actually, in the last 3 or 4 months, we discovered that INGOs and UN agencies are asking local organizations inside Yemen and the IPs either to sign a paper or to write in their bylaws that they don't have any political position in order to be funded. So I think the international community set a tone inside Yemen and prevented INGOs or engaged the INGOs in something that they did not do in Syria and Iraq and other crises where they took risks. And actually, I really like to have a comment on this.
Sure. Does anyone want to take them?
Shall I start? 2 very good and often quite tricky questions to answer. What I will say in terms of how, at least from an Oxfam perspective, we partner with local organizations is based on humanitarian principles. So principles of impartiality, operational neutrality, and independence. That means that we work with organizations that adhere to those, and that doesn't mean that staff or individuals do not have perceived or actual political affiliations. I mean, Lord knows humanitarians also get accused of having political bias all of the time in places like Yemen and elsewhere. And we work very hard to maintain and base all of our work based on those standards. I certainly can't speak for the UN or for other INGOs, but with regards to how we work with civil society, that's kind of where we start. Oxfam also has committed under a couple of processes about the structural reform of humanitarian assistance to work more closely and with local partners in a way that doesn't treat them as implementing partners, and so is trying to build the capacity of the organizations that we work with to give them proportions of funding directly and to support them to be able to access funding directly through the UN and other networks. And those are under processes called the Grand Bargain and the New Way of Working, and they are global processes with metrics that Oxfam is required to perform against, and that reporting is done publicly on a global level, so in all countries that we work on. In terms of how money goes to people in Yemen, we take our commitment both to our public donors, because a lot of Oxfam's money actually comes from individual contributions and donations, as well as to our government and UN donors extremely seriously. And we devote considerable time to ensuring that we have the monitoring and evaluation systems in place to make sure that if there are concerns about aid diversion, whether that is at local level with partners or with the authorities who are in control of the areas that we're operating under, that those are identified and investigated as quickly as possible. I won't take up too much time, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about what those look like and about the standards in which we operate, both as Oxfam but also as the international community trying to work in Yemen.
On the question of weapons, quickly, that the question that was asked, I just want to clarify. it's not a question of illegal weapons, it's the use of the weapons illegally. It's just a semantics thing for international law purposes. But so, because there's a distinction between an illegal weapon and then a perfectly legal weapon that's used in an illegal way because it's used in targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. That semantics issue aside, obviously I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of these governments and why they engage in these decisions. You've already touched on the financial considerations that are obviously at play, the political alliances between governments and, you know, there are certain allies in the region. But what we can clarify for these governments is that this puts them in direct involvement or complicity in violations of international law that they can't absolve themselves from. And we've tried to take this to courts in the UK, in meetings, in advocacy meetings around the world. It's interesting, for example, when the issue of the particular issue in the court, and I'm using one of our former colleagues from Human Rights Watch when she was clarifying on the issue of arms sales particularly, when the issue was the UK arms sales case, for example, was taken to a court in the UK, NGO reporting on the weapons being used in illegal attacks was disregarded, partly because of the lack of access to airstrike sites, right? So it is all connected to issues of access and, not that we're unable to do our documentation remotely, but obviously to be able to access these sites is of much bigger as I've seen at times of much bigger value. So all we can do is to keep up the pressure and to continue documenting this problematic use and to continue support certain pieces of legislation that are ensuring that this pressure is definitely stepped up.
Maybe 3 questions from the center. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, Zaid Nagy, a Yemeni American activist.
Just the mic.
Zaid Nagy, a Yemeni American activist. My question is for Sister Afrah. You said that the Yemeni activist, Rageh al-Mutawakkil, the controversial Yemeni activist, Rageh al-Mutawakkil, gave a testimony in front of Congress and later faced a backlash and harassment on social media. And you came up to a conclusion that that harassment came from different political parties. My question is, that harassment, that backlash, being that the social media is the only source that the ordinary Yemeni on the ground who is not aligned with any faction, being that's its only mean to say, why couldn't US policymaker use that backlash as a warning that something was wrong in the testimony? Why couldn't that backlash represent the real Yemeni voice? Thank you.
Go ahead, sir. Right here.
Since the war started, many Yemenis NGOs have emerged in the U.S., and a lot of them have been reaching out to the Yemeni diaspora for funds. However, the capacity is very limited to reach out to U.S. farmer. I know they allocate certain amount of funds for nonprofit organization. Because of their capacity of not being a 501c, have organizations such as Kathy's organization been involved in, especially we have a lot of issues with waterborne diseases in Yemen. The second question, which is very political, is most of the Yemenis in the US try to send funds to their family members, and companies such as Western Unions and MoneyGrams don't allow funds to be transferred because of issues with national security. Yep. Can that be addressed? Thanks.
Go ahead, right there.
Thank you. My name is Marie-Christine. I am a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. I'd like to talk to Ms. Achilles about the impact of humanitarian impact on the ground. You've mentioned about, also Ms. Rageh has mentioned about the women she saw looking for their sons whom they didn't know where they may be in prison and how long, why they were put in prison. So I would like to mention, most of the humanitarian aid that is on the ground is for basic needs, actually, food, medical, but there has been issues. It's been 25 years since the genocide of Rwanda has been, and I've been working with survivors since through different organizations like UNHCR, ICRC, International Red Cross, and through my own organization. Been helping survivors to know, to overcome the trauma, but I have realized that there are many issues that can be happening in Yemen, affecting the children now, but they don't know, affecting the parents, affecting everyone on the ground, but they are not aware of the effects such things can cause to them. It's been now 25 years. We find some children, some survivors who had children that time, now being affected in mental health issues because they had issues that they had never been told of, they had never been dealt with. So is there any help of making awareness of such kind of effects of trauma that may affect these people? Also talking about dignity.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll address them. Thank you so much. Anybody want to take care?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. Just on the last point, I think, yeah, the long-term impacts on physical, mental health and emotional well-being of conflict is underinvested in, and often we respond to short-term needs because we have to, because we have limited funding, and those are the ones in front of us. And I think there are lots of organizations inside Yemen trying to do what we call psychosocial support, especially with women and particularly with children, to try and support those. And I completely agree. I think taking a longer-term view and making sure that we plan appropriately for Yemen's recovery and for people's recovery is going to be vital. On this issue of Yemeni diaspora funding and funding into Yemen, this is a huge problem for humanitarians as well as the diaspora, although I think our issue always pales in significance compared to the amount of money that the diaspora send to Yemen. We often have to try and rely on these same types of systems, the Hawala systems, informal networks, to be able to move money around Yemen. And what we find is that a lot of the same issues start to restrict our work, which is banks' confidence and banks' concerns about who we're all giving money to. So our colleagues in Oxfam America do quite a bit of work here in the US, looking at Yemen, but also with Syria and Somalia, where this is also a particular issue for diaspora funding, to look at the impacts, the formal impacts of legislation and sanctions and restrictions that prevent us from being able to send money in certain ways, but also what we call the chilling effect of that legislation on banks' ability or willingness to take on the risk, given the complexities of access and banking, formal banking services inside Yemen and other places. So it's certainly something that we are very attuned to, both in terms of the massive contribution that diaspora communities often make in the humanitarian response, as well as in our own work as well.
Did you want to say
something? Yeah. I think if we discuss Rawya in personal, or in specific, she had faced many threats, not only online, like her peers, like other journalists, other activists. Unfortunately, especially in the US, among the Yemeni American community, there seems to be a monopoly about any narrative about the conflict, and any kind of independent thinking or independent or free thinking is, being attacked or rejected. But you're absolutely entitled to have your opinion, but I have nothing else to say.
We have one more question for closing remarks.
Well, actually, can we address her question on mental health? Yeah. Yes, I want to address the question on mental health, because I think this is such an important point that it's very easy to lose in the urgency of what's happening in Yemen. First of all, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, does actually require that both physical harm, but also potential mental harm be considered when attacking parties are planning and assessing the civilian impact of attacks. What this means is that if someone is planning, if a warring party is planning to carry out a bombing, it is part of their duty to consider not only the civilian lives that may be lost or the injuries that may occur, but also the mental injuries, the mental harm that could occur as a result of attacks. It's not an area that's well developed in the laws of war. It's something that advocates in this area are working to advance. There's actually a very interesting project done by the Sana Center for Strategic Studies in conjunction with the Columbia Law School Human Rights Clinic, working to study the impact of the conflict on mental health in Yemen and look at the provision of services both by the Yemeni government and by other actors. So there is work being done in this area, but I really want to thank you for raising this point because these effects will, of course, last for decades to come.
Last question? We're out of time. All right, so my, I guess, most important announcement was that lunch will be served in this room in the back. Please help me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. It's been an honor to be with you.